Today we're just going to show you how to work with fun fur. A lot of people have questions about how to work with it. So we're going to show you how to cut it and then how to sew it. How to sew a lengthwise seam, nice and flat, and also how to do a seam that's a little bit more supported for places where there's a bit more tension. So the first thing we need to do is mark our cutting lines on the back of our fabric. So when we want to cut fur, we're going to use just the tips of our scissors. That's going to keep us from cutting through all of the fur. So you find once we have cut through with just the tips of our scissors, when we turn the fabric over and have a look, all of the fur is still attached. When we're ready to start pinning our fabric, we're going to bring it right sides together. And the thing we want to do here is make sure that the fur is not getting caught in the seam. So we want to gently push the fur away from the edge of the fabric. I'm going to do this with my hands, but some people will use a comb or a hairbrush or even masking tape. And then we're going to start pinning, making sure none of that fur is getting caught in the seam. So before we get started with the sewing, I just want to say that when you're sewing fur to fur, you want to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you're working with a pattern that uses 5/8 of an inch seam allowances, you're going to have to trim your seam allowance down to a 1/4 inch. I've set my sewing machine to a 1/4 inch zigzag stitch, and I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric to where the needle goes in on the right side. And what we want to do is we want to ensure that the needle is actually going off the edge of the fabric on the right, and then it's going to go into the fabric on the left with that zigzag stitch. We want to continually check that the fur is out of the way of the seam where you're sewing. So now we've got our seam finished. I'm going to show you how to make it nice and flat. So here we have our finished seam, and I'm going to show you the reason we let the needle go right off the fabric is that we can open up our seam and we're going to tug on it. And because that very edge of the fabric isn't actually stitched, we can finger press it with our finger, applying pressure, and that fabric is basically now going to be butted against itself. So it's very flat, and when we turn it right sides out, because we've made sure all the fur hasn't been caught in the seam, you won't even be able to see where that seam is. It's actually right there. I can barely feel it, and you can probably barely see it. If you're sewing a seam that maybe has a lot of tension on it or stress on it, like a shoulder seam or the top of a sleeve, it's probably a good idea to stabilize the seam with a bit of twill tape. So we're going to line up the edge of the twill tape with the edge of our fabric, and again lining it up with the needle in the right position. And we're going to sew just like we did, but now we're lining up 3 edges, again sewing right off that edge. But this will also help keep your shoulder seam from stretching. A lot of fur fabrics are on knits, so they would tend to stretch out potentially on any crosswise seams. So this twill tape will really prevent that from happening. So for the purposes of our video, we're going to pretend that this seam was like a shoulder seam on a jacket or a vest, and I just wanted to show you once we turn that around. The seam is nice and stable. And again, because the fur was kind of pushed away from the seam is nice and full with fur. It doesn't look bare. Thanks so much for joining us for this video. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram for much more content.